Welcome to Close Listening, ArtOnAir.org's program of readings and conversations with poets, produced in collaboration with Penn Sound. My guest today for the second of two programs is Zeyar Lynn. Zeyar Lynn is a poet, critic, writer, translator, and language instructor. He teaches English in Yangon, Myanmar, Burma. His work has recently appeared in an anthology edited by James Byrne and Coco Thet, Bones Will Crow, the first anthology of Burmese poetry, just published in the United States by Northern Illinois University Press. My name is Charles Bernstein. On today's program, Zeyar Lynn will read a selection of his poems. Go to Penn Sound to hear more of his work. Zeyar Lynn, welcome back to Close Listening, and welcome to the Kelly Writers House.
Thank you, Charles. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm glad that you nice people have turned up in spite of the rain. Yes, I'd like to read some of my poems that have been translated and published in this anthology called Bones Will Crow, edited and translated by Coco Thet and James Byrne. The American edition is published by Northern Illinois Press. It came out I think 4 or 5 months ago. The first poem I'm going to read is My History Is Not Mine. I'd like to read it in Burmese first, okay, to give you a flavor of how Burmese sounds, yeah? Ngā tamai ha, ngā tamai mahopu. Ngā te pilo da, dago ngā makoe mahuet pio yere. Ngā tamai go yege ra, ngā mahopu. Lu se yau ma, sete yau ngā ko matibu. Tudo yege re ngā tamai go, tudo matibu. Amate ha yaung sa zia, ngā ma bahama mashibu. Jan piusu zia, matan tin zia, tudo yege ja ma ba. ဒါပေမဲ့ငါမမှတ်မိဘူးကြောက်စာတိုင်းမရှိဘူးအုတ်ကူမရှိဘူးအယိုးမရှိဘူးပြာတောင်မရှိဘူးငါတမိုင်းကိုငါရေးခဲ့တာမဟုတ်ဘူးသူတို့ရေးခဲ့တာသူတို့ပညာရှင်တွေသူတို့ရေးခဲ့တာသူတို့အမှန်တရားတွေသူတို့ရေးခဲ့တာရွှေမှုန်ကျဲဒန္တာကြီးတွေအဲ့ဒီထဲမှာငါဘယ်နှစပါခဲ့တယ်လဲငါတည်သွင်းငါမသိခဲ့ဘူး ငါတေခြင်းကိုသူတို့ပဲရေးခဲ့ကြတယ်တေခြင်းအချင်းချင်းကြားမှာငါဟာအမည်မဖော်လို့သူတေခြင်းလို့ဒုက္ခိတတေခြင်းလို့တေခြင်းတောင်မစစ်မှန်ခဲ့ရဘူးတေခြင်းမှာလဲငါဟာနေနှင်ခံရပြန်တယ်ငါမှာပြစရာစာရွက်စာတမ်းအထောက်အထားတွေသူတို့ပြည့်ပြည့်စုံစုံမရေးခဲ့ကြပြန်ဘူးတေခြင်းမှာငါနေထိုင်ခွင့်မရှိပြန်ဘူး ငါတေခြင်းကိုသူတို့ပဲရေးကြတယ်ငါတေခြင်းကိုသူတို့လေတဲ့ရေးကြတယ်ရေးကြတယ်ရေးကြတယ်ရေးတယ်ရေးကြတယ်ငါပြန်ဖတ်ရတယ်ဒါဟာငါတမိုင်းပဲစကလုံးပေါင်းမှာတရားလွဲချောတပ်ပုံတောင်ဘယ်လိုအတန်ထွက်ရမလဲမသိငါတမိုင်းကိုသူတို့ရေးပြီးငါ့ကိုတမိုင်းတက်ကထုတ်လိုက်တယ်အခုမှပဲငါတမိုင်းဟာစားတော့တယ် Okay, so now this English version. My history is not mine. I'm already dead. I can say this unreservedly. It wasn't me who wrote my history. 11 out of 10 people don't know me. Historians have no idea about my history written by historians. I have no souvenir whatever for sale. PhD scholars, journalists, they might have written my history, but I don't remember it. No stone inscription, no tomb, no bone, not even ash. I have not written my history. They have written it for me, those academics. They have written their own versions. What they have written were mythologies sprinkled with gold dust. How many sprinkles did I amount to in there? I wasn't aware of the death pit. They have written even my own death, and amid deaths and deader deaths, I was almost dead untitled, a crippled death. Even the death wasn't genuine. Even in death, I was exiled. They did not fully write my supporting documents. Even in death, I did not have a residence permit. They have written my death. They have written my death in air. They have written my death in water. I read it again, my own history. Misspellings, missed grammar. I don't even know how to pronounce the word vocabulary. They have written my history, then they have airbrushed me from history. My history has just begun. I am going to write my own history. This poem came out in 2003, so which means it's 10 years old, and it was written and published during the time of very severe censorship era, which lasted for 48 years and 2 weeks. So in order to get this poem past the censorship board, I had to put the words of this poem into the mouth of a dead man. so you know, the censorship officers didn't find it dangerous because this is a dead person speaking. It won't harm the regime. So we had to think of ingenious ways to get past the censorship board. Another way I got my poems through the censorship was to come up with a new style of writing poems. And it's a list poem, or called a catalog poem. And I got the idea from a poem called Brazil, co-written by Charles and another Brazilian writer, if I...
Regis
Regis,
Mondicino.
yes. And in that poem, you know, I like the way the poem was not a narrative, and it wasn't coherent in any way, but it was just line, you know, just line by line with only one word that was repeated: Brazil, 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 Brazil. So I used that in my poem, and the word I used was beard. I'll read this in English first. The ways of the beards. There is a hair, the rhymeless of the world unite in Marx's beard. Not growing a beard is existentialism, says Sartre. Helen's beard that launched 1,000 ships. Beard looking for a chin like words for a poem. Beard is the war-torn town of the Chin in Civil War. In the history of Chin, beard is the defeated truth. The world burned down at Marilyn's beard. The mediocrities look elegant in media beards, honored with flexible beard awards. The beard of the capital decorated with electric lamps. Oh, the beard of dreams beyond form. The beard of the desert whirling at the end of my vision, a small red mole still running on the beard of social realism. We have emerged from the raincoat of the famous blue beard, beard sobbing over my shoulder. This has happened. This has happened in Maria. This has happened in beard. The news of the beard ghost, harrowing, yet scientifically proven. The youthful beard, the powerful storm. Just take care of your beard. Language will take care of itself. Instead of writing poetry, why not just grow a beard? Hey, beards of the world, let's get out of the Lanigo. Into the scene of the beard on trial, many myths are said to be trafficked in. Probing at the word, the scar of the beard was found. Don't let the flag fall. Fight on until only your beard remains, say the Banzai T-shirts. Stop Press News. The beard has just called himself you. The spokesbeard has been shaved temporarily. His beard was also silenced. So goes the story. Post-beardism and the history of histories scattered. The robbery of the three primary roots of the beard. A handbook to mental attitude analysis by Zen Beard. The mourning of the hummingbirds in the cage. The virtuous beards who are no saints. Sisyphus rolling up the untrimmable beard of the gods. This is my favorite. This beard is my brand, she said. History will forgive my beard. To install electric power all over the country, to establish beard power all over the land. Go away, you swineherd. You only love your beard. A beard is a beard, it's a beard, it's a rose, it's a rose, it's a rose. All of you belong to the beardless generation. God is playing dice with the beard. So you will notice that in that poem, I use a lot of quotations, but I played with them so that, the quotations don't come out in the original way. But
and that's translated by Coco Thet, the co-editor of the anthology. How conscious would readers in Burma be of the references that are very apparent to some of us here, like Gertrude Stein, a rose is a rose is a rose? Would that be something that people would recognize necessarily? Or
Yes.
Is that
Yes, a lot of Burmese poets are very well read. They've read a lot of translations of a lot of poets. And Gertrude Stein is very difficult to translate, but what I did was I translated this very important essay on experimentation, I think. And then for her other writings, what I had to do was to rephrase them. So, the translations lost a lot of the original sense or original rhythms, but those who read them know something about Gertrude Stein, and so they know this rose is a rose.
And what is the Burmese word for beard that we're going to hear over and over in a second?
Mosik. Okay. Mosik to eat toaya lamya. Marx ye mosik tema. Gaba kaya memya silongja tachang pare. Sartka mosik matada ha piti mu padana wada de. Pinle pinne sitem hota town selo like da Helen ye mosik. ကြပြာကိုရှာနေတဲ့စကလုံးတွေလိုမင်းစိတ်ကိုရှာနေတဲ့မုတ်စိတ်မုတ်စိတ်ဟာစစ်ဖြစ်နေတဲ့မင်းစိတ်ရဲ့စစ်ပြေးမျိုးပဲမယ်ရီလင်ရဲ့မုတ်စိတ်မှာကဘာကြီးမီးဆွဲလောင်ခဲ့လူရမဝင်တွေဟာမီဒီယာမုတ်စိတ်တွေနဲ့ခံညာကြဆွဲဆန့်လို့ရတဲ့ရာဘာမုတ်စိတ်တွေနဲ့ချီးမြှင့်ကြလက်စင်မီးတွေဆင်ထားတဲ့မြို့တွေရဲ့မုတ်စိတ်အိုးပုံတံမေလွန်းတဲ့အိမ်မက်များရဲ့မုတ်စိတ်မျက်စိတစုံမှာတဲကန်တရရဲ့မုတ်စိတ်မွေးတွေတဖွာဖွာလွင့်ဘဝတဲကအနုပညာဟာမုတ်စိတ်ဘောကမှဲ့နီလေးပြေးနေတယ်နာမည်ကျော်မုတ်စိတ်ပြာရဲ့မုခါတဲကကျွန်တော်တို့ထွက်လာတာကျွန်တော်ပခုံးပေါ်မှီပြီးမုတ်စိတ်ရှုံရှုံငိုရဲ့ဒါဖြစ်ခဲ့တယ်မာရီယာမှာဖြစ်ခဲ့တယ်မုတ်စိတ်မှာဖြစ်ခဲ့တယ်တိတ်ပန်နိကြမုတ်စိတ်တစ်စိ6ခံရခြင်းတည်းမုတ်စိတ်ကနုနုမုံနိုင်ကထန်းထန်းမုတ်စိတ်ကိုတတိထားဘာသာစကားဟာသူ့အလုပ်သူလုပ်လိမ့်မယ်ကြပြာရင်းမဲ့စာမုတ်စိတ်တွေသာမွေးပါလေဟေးကဘာမုတ်စိတ်တို့မြို့အိတ်တွေမှထွက်ကြစို့မုတ်စိတ်တရားစီရင်ကမ်းမှာဒန္တာကြီးတွေခိုးတွင်းတဲ့စကလုံးကိုစမ်းလိုက်တော့မုတ်စိတ်ရဲ့အမာရွတ်ကိုတွေ့ရှိပေါ့မုတ်စိတ်ဖဲချင်အလံမလှဲစတန်းဘန်ဇိုင်းတီရှပ်တွေစိတ်ရတဲ့မုတ်စိတ်ဟာသူ့ကိုယ်သူတင်းလို့ခေါ်နေပြီပြောရေးဆိုခွင့်မုတ်စိတ်ခိတရိတ်ခံရသူ့မုတ်စိတ်ပါနှုတ်ပိတ်ခံလိုက်ရတယ်ဆိုတဲ့အကြောင်း post မုတ်စိတ်တဘောတရားနဲ့တမိုင်းများလွင့်စင်ခြင်းတမိုင်းမုတ်စိတ်ရဲ့ရေတောက်မြစ်သုံးတွေအခိုးခံရခြင်းဇန်မုတ်စိတ်ရဲ့စိတ်နေစိတ်ထားသုံးသက်ချက်လက်ဆွဲချမ်းလောင်ကျိုင်တဲ့ကမုတ်စိတ်တို့ရဲ့သေးတည်တံနဲ့ခင်းသူတော်စင်တွေမဟုတ်ပေမဲ့တီလမင်းတဲ့မုတ်စိတ်တွေစစ်စစ်ဖတ်လိမ့်တင်တဲ့နတ်ဖျားတို့ရဲ့ရိတ်မရမုတ်စိတ် အဲ့ဒါကျမအကြိုက်ဆုံးကျမအမြဲသုံးတဲ့မုတ်စိတ်တမိုင်းဟာငတ်မုတ်စိတ်ကိုခွန့်လွတ်မယ်တနိုင်ငံလုံးလျှက်စစ်တအားတတ်ဆင်ဖို့နဲ့မုတ်စိတ်အင်အားထူထောင်ဖို့တော့စိတ်ပုတ်သူမုတ်စိတ်ပဲသူချစ်မုတ်စိတ်ဟာမုတ်စိတ်ဟာမုတ်စိတ်ဟာနှင်းစီဟာနှင်းစီဟာနှင်းစီဟာမုတ်စိတ်ဟာမင်းတို့အားလုံးမုတ်စိတ်ပြောက်ဆုံးမျိုးဆက်ပဲဖျားသခင်ဟာမုတ်စိတ်နဲ့ကြွေရန်ကစားနေပြီ
You're listening to Zeyar Lynn on Close Listening.
At that time, we were not allowed to use words such as poverty or electricity in our poems because most of the time we were in darkness. There were, power cuts almost every day, and we didn't even have one whole day of electricity up to now. So I had to slip in this reference to electricity in this poem to install electric power all over the country. And I had to cover that up again to establish beard power all over the land. So, sort of making serious things humorous, like trivial, inconsequential, even banal. But that was a way I had to get past the censorship.
And would the people hearing and reading those poems reverse those things that you're doing? Be very because a beard anyway means, at least in American vernacular or slang, a cover, like a criminal cover. So the very process you're talking about is a kind of beard. The beard is a beard is a beard.
Yes, I was asked by this chief of the censorship, Brigadier General Tin Lui, I think, and he asked me why. What this word beard stood for. And I said, I don't know. It's according to your interpretation. You can interpret it in any way you like. As for me, I just use this word beard, and I don't even know what it stands for. So maybe, like what Charles said, maybe I use that idea of the beard to hide something, maybe to hide what I actually wanted to say. But then readers are good at, reading between the lines, and they can just ignore the beard and they take out they extract the important parts in the poem.
So now that you can say all of that, does it make the poem unnecessary? How does it change the cryptographic nature of what you did?
Well, in terms of style, now since censorship has officially been abolished in August 2012. A lot of poems that have come out in magazines are very direct. A lot of people are writing very documentary poems, talking about the atrocities of the government. And one collection of poems that came out before I came here was a collaboration of 5 ex-prisoners, ex-political prisoners. They were imprisoned when they were 18 years old. At a young age, they were imprisoned for 65 years, but they've been released. And they brought out this book called Prison Poems. So this sort of style could be considered out of date or old-fashioned. And it has become somewhat a contemporary classical poem, and a lot of younger generation poets know that. But I think this poem still is effective, maybe not so much because of the references or the content, but the way it was written for the first time and published for the first time in Burmese poetry scene.
Were there a lot of poets jailed during that time of your generation for things related to their artistic work?
Now, a lot of people in the West are sort of misguided into thinking that poets are imprisoned for writing poems in Myanmar. That's not true. They were imprisoned because of their political activism. And most of the poets happen to be political activists. And so they were caught, interrogated, and imprisoned because of their political activities, especially because they were either party members of NLD, National League for Democracy, headed by Aung San Suu Kyi, or they were part of this ex-Burmese Communist Party members, underground activists. So a lot of them, I would say almost all of them, were arrested, not because they wrote poetry, but because they were activists and because so I would say that only one person who is very well known for being imprisoned for his poem was Saw Wei. He wrote a Valentine's Day poem, but he wrote it in such a way that the first syllables, when read line by line, has this meaning of power-hungry General Tan Shui. So that was very explicit, and he was imprisoned for 2 years. That was the only instance of a poet being jailed for his poem. But like I said, I didn't go to prison because I wasn't involved in that political activities, because I worked in the university for about 15 years, and as a government employee, we had to stay away from politics. And we had to even, pretend that there's no such thing as opposition in the country, that the government was the legal government and all that, But my way of responding to the situation was to write poems, and especially to come up with new forms of poems. And I owe a lot to Charles, because I learned from Charles that form can also be political, not just the content.
Are your generation of political prisoners now out of jail?
Yes, all of them are.
That's good.
But one thing is, when we started writing during the late 70s, early 80s, and these poet friends of mine went to prison in 1989, 1990, and they came out like last year. And they wrote poems while they were in prison. And now, like I said, some of them have come up with this collection of prison poems. But their poems are very dated. They were still writing in the form that was popular 20 years ago. So in that sense, my poems are more fresh, more up to date. And then their poems were also very in the form of this mainstream style, mainstream Kippo modern style, a very eye-based, emotion-oriented lyric form. So that's what I noticed between my friends who were in prison and myself and others who were not in prison. The difference is obvious. It's in the style of writing. The next poem is called Slideshow. Again, I have used fragments to construct this poem. So again, there's no coherence, there's no story, no narrative. It's just fragments, fragments, fragments. And again, I learned to take this style from reading American language poetry, works of language poetry. So I'm very much influenced by the New York School, Frank O'Hara, John Ashbery, and language poetry, especially Charles Bernstein, Bob Perelman, who are easier to read and easier to translate.
And this is Ron Solomon facing you.
Hello, sir. Nice to meet you. I was just telling Charles that I just couldn't finish the alphabet. So this poem slideshow is, I think it was written to give the idea that, all the news that we get, all the international news, the local news that we get, come censored. The government even censors its own news. So, and then we never get the full news. We just get, fragments of it, and we know nothing about it. And there's always this jamming of all the news. BBC was jammed, VOA was jammed, and it was against the law to listen to BBC and VOA. You can go to jail for 20 years for listening to VOA. Slideshow. Life is back to normal. Next slide. In the West, it's a different story. Next slide. Shall we also discuss the issue of the privileged? Next slide. Impossible. I've said it many times. Next slide. Maria Xiao, Channel News Asia, Beijing. Next slide. Since I've decided to wear only trousers, not a single paso has entered my head for 10 years. Similarly, a poem or maungba. Next slide. By using traditional technology, we continue to produce successful shrimp pastes. Next slide. The body parts of the hostages have to be matched with their identity cards. Next slide. Shibboleths in lieu of heartbeats. Your call cannot be reached at the moment. What if no one comes when the Great War is staged someday? Next slide. Since 13 and a half, I have made love to 10,000 women. I just wanted to connect with at least one of them. Next slide. Loathing plus fear and loathing. Next slide. The laughter I've learned masks those I've suppressed. Next slide. What's life? It's a sexually transmittable disease. Let's share it. Next slide. The lives that have been barely alive and gone. Next slide. Idiocy. Air, idiocy. No. Life has to be entered from the other door. Next slide. The light that is left saying, just a moment. Next slide. We all live in a yellow submarine, yellow submarine, yellow submarine. Next slide. To fly through the invisible fence. Next slide. The issue is as simple as that, I reckon. Those who have existed, spoken, and written before me were awe-inspiring and respectable. They were real scholars and genuinely learned men. I assume that you gentlemen are listening to me, standing and speaking in front of you in a similarly courteous way you would to a madman speaking. Thank you so very much for putting up with, forgiving, watching, and looking at the shadow of a life that has been trying to come to terms with life in its own way, that has been struggling. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide.
You're listening to Zeyar Lynn on Close Listening. He's just read the Coco Thet translation of Slideshow from the new anthology Bones Will Crow, the first anthology of Burmese poetry published by Northern Illinois University Press. And now, could you read us the Burmese version? And is the yellow submarine line there in Roman script in the Burmese?
Yellow submarine is in English, as it should be. Slideshow. ဘဝဟာပုံမှန်ပြန်ဖြစ်နေပါပြီ Slide 2ပါအနောက်ဖက်အရက်မှာတော့ပုံမြင်တစ်မျိုးပေါ့ Slide 2ပါစီးပွားရေးအခွင့်အတူကံကိစ္စတွေလည်းဆွေးနွေးကြတာပေါ့ Slide 2ပါမဖြစ်နိုင်ဘူးဆိုတော့အတန်တန်ပြောပြီးသား Slide 2ပါ Maria Xiao Channel News Asia Beijing Slide 2ပါကျွန်တော်ဘောင်းမီပဲဝတ်တော့မယ်လို့ဆုံးဖြတ်လိုက်ကြတဲ့က ပစိုးတစ်ထဲမှာခေါင်းထဲမဝင်တော့တာ10နှစ်ရှိပြီထို့အတူကြပြာတို့မဟုတ်မောင်ဘ slide 2ပါကျွန်တော်တို့ဟာအစင်လာနီးပညာနဲ့အောင်မြင်တဲ့ကပိတွေဆက်လက်ထုတ်လုပ်နေပါကြောင်း slide 2ပါတစကန်တူရဲ့ကိုအင်ကအပိုင်းစာတွေကိုမှတ်ပုံတင်နဲ့တိုက်ကြည့်ရန် slide 2ပါရင်ခုန်တန်အစားကျိုးကြော်တန်တွေရှိတယ်စစ်သွယ်မှု area ပြင်ပသို့ရောက်ရှိနေပါသဖြင့်တနေ့နေ့စစ်ပွဲကြီးကျင်းပလို့ဘယ်သူမှမလာဘူးဆိုရင်ကော slide 2ပါ73နှစ်ခရဲကမိမ1000နဲ့ချစ်မှုပြုခဲ့တာအနည်းဆုံးတယောက်ယောက်နဲ့ဆက်သွယ်ခြင်းခဲ့ခြင်းလို့ပါပဲ slide 2ပါယွန်ချင်းကြောက်ချင်းယွန်ကြောက်ချင်း slide 2ပါတင်ယူခဲ့တဲ့ရည်တံတွေဟာမထွက်ရဲတဲ့ရည်တံတွေရဲ့မျက်နှာဖုံးတွေ slide 2ပါဟောဆိုတာပါလေလိန်ဆက်ဆံမှုကြောင့်ရလိုက်တဲ့ကုဆက်ယောဂါပေါ့မျှဝေခံစားကြစို့ slide 2ပါရှင်ယုံတင်ရှင်ပြီးပျောက်ဆုံးသွားတဲ့ဘဝတွေ slide 2ပါအလော့လေတံအလော့မဟုတ်ဘူးဘဝဆိုတော့ဟိုဘက်ပေါက်ကဝင်ရတာ slide 2ပါခဏဆိုပြီးထွက်သွားတဲ့အလင်း slide 2ပါ We all live in a yellow submarine slide 2ပါမမြင်ရတဲ့စီယိုကိုဖောက်ထွင်းဖြတ်တန်းဖို့ slide 2ပါကိစ္စကတော့ဒါပါပဲလို့ကျွန်တော်ထင်ပါတယ်ကျွန်တော်ရှေ့ကရှိခဲ့ရေးခဲ့ပြောခဲ့ကြတဲ့သူတွေဟာကြောက်လန့်လေးစားရတဲ့တကယ်ပညာရှင်တွေတကယ်ပညာရှိတွေပါပဲလူကြီးမင်းတို့ရှေ့မှောက်မှာကျွန်တော်ခုလိုရက်စကားပြောနေတာဟာအယူတရက်ကိုအားနာပါနာအားပေးနေကြတာလို့ကျွန်တော်ယူဆပါတယ်ဘဝကိုကျွန်တော်ဟန်နဲ့နားလည်ဖို့ကြိုးစားရင်းရုန်းကန်နေရတဲ့အရေးတစ်ခုကိုအခုထိတီးခံခွင့်လွှတ်ကြည့်ရှုနားဆင်ပေးတဲ့အတွက်ကျွန်တော်ဘက်ကကျေးဇူးအထူးတင်ရှိပါတယ် slide 2ပါ 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 and in that poem I used different fragments taken from different discourses there are spoofs from advertisements then the kind of tone that we usually find in the evening news and there's overheard conversation of lovers a father scolding his son for taking part in activities that are dangerous to the family, so things like that. So this whole poem can be read in different voices. What I did once in Rangoon was to ask the audience to read one fragment each, and I would just read slide 2 bar, slide 2 bar, slide 2 bar. So it came out, in different voices, and which made it more something like a performance.
This is something I think we discussed in the previous close listening show, but how does the influence of Western literary forms, both earlier and contemporary, within your poetry and some of the contemporaries in the anthology, read to people in Burma? How is that interpreted or reflected on? Western or American?
In 1968, an anthology of translated poems came out in Burma, and it was called In the Shade of the Pine Tree. And it was translated by Maungtano, and when he translated that, he was in prison himself for political activities. So he translated a lot of romantic poets, Keats, Wordsworth, and a lot of European poets, French poets, Apollinaire, Alexander Bloch. And that anthology changed the whole of Myanmar poetry at that time, because this Maungtano also asked one question to the poets in Burma: where is modern poetry in Burma? I can't even get a smell of it. So that was how modern poetry, or Kipo Kabya, started in Burma. And the major difference between the traditional poetry and this modern poetry is the lack of rhyme in modern poetry. So it was verse libre, rhymeless, and those poets who started writing this modern poetry took the model of the translated poems that were, of course, in translations they were without rhyme. So up to now, as I speak, a lot of conservative poets in Myanmar would not recognize modern poetry as poetry because there was no rhyme. So, so that was the influence, the major influence of this translations of Western poetry in Myanmar poetry. It started off this Myanmar modernism. Then during the 90s, I started translating. I started with Sylvia Plath, her life and her works. Then I went on to translate post-Soviet Russian poets, Ashbery, Frank O'Hara, Kenneth Koch, Szymborska. Then I came across language poetry while I was reading post-Soviet Russian poets like Pashchikov, Dragomushenko, Shevats, and that was how I learned that there was such a thing as language poetry in the world, and I learned it from the Russian poets. So I translated Charles's interviews, his poems, Perelman, Lynn Haginian's poems, then Bernadette Mayer. So that started off this language poetry in Myanmar poetry scene. And up to now, whenever this name Zeyar Lynn comes up, it always comes together with LP, language poetry. And I always say, I am not a language poet. I just introduced language poetry into Myanmar. I am not a language poet. That I may use disjunctive strategies used by language poets, but I am not a language poet. I am just a poet. So, then I also introduced Plath, Gary Sullivan, Nada Gordon, Sharon Mesmer, and this younger generation group of poets who call themselves Pem School. They are deeply into Plath, and they have internet Gmail contact with Nada almost every day. And then the next thing I did was, since I got hold of language poetry maybe 2 decades late, it was already the time of people like Juliana Spar, Peter Gitze, and I found that there was this thing called post-language poetry. And I was still going through language poetry, but there was already post-language. And, it was a shock to me, but I still translated them so that the Burmese poets would know what's contemporary. So people like Peter Gitze, Juliana Spar, Lisa Roberts, Mark Levine, so they've been translated in Burmese. And I label them according to what Mark Wallace said, post-language poets. Then I found this book. I got this book from a friend by Cole Swenson and I forgot the other person, American Hybrid Poetry. David St. John. Mm-hmm. And then another book was by Reginald Shepard, New Postmodern Poetries, or something like that. And then this year, when Robert Haas and Brenda Hillman visited Myanmar, I asked Brenda, I said, I saw your poems in this book and that book too. Are you an elliptical poet or a hybrid poet? And she said, labels don't matter. So to answer your question, this younger generation, especially the younger generation of poets, are influenced very much by American poetry, by language poetry, by Plath poetry, or post-Plath now, I think, and post-language or elliptical or whatever. And there is a poet called Nyein Wei who started his own Burmese conceptual poetics. and he has connections with Kenny Goldsmith, Robert Fitterman too, I think, because Robert was saying that to me yesterday. So, but that conceptual poetry hasn't caught on in Burma yet because it's too intellectual, I think. For example, somebody wrote a conceptual poem, and it was a list of guns, names of guns, Remington and stuff. And this person showed me his poem, and I said, okay, you've written a list of guns. Where is the poetry? And he said, we don't need poetry. This is conceptual poetry. So I think we need to reconsider what conceptual poetry means in Burmese context.
So one follow-up on that fascinating history, often in China, for example, there's a way in which the influence of Western, both modern Western and contemporary Western writing is resisted, or at least figures very differently than it does in the place where it originates, where it's not marked in that way. And how is that read in the Burmese context for you? The fact that it's imported, is it a shared collective enterprise that we're involved in, which I very much feel with you? How does that read?
What I did was, not just to translate the poems. I also explained the poems. I gave the context. I went back to history before, for example, before language poetry. There was this kind of poetry, and then I used a lot of material from Charles's writings, this official verse culture, which was almost similar to our situation. The Kippo modern poetry was that official verse culture. It was I-based. It must be an expression of emotion. It has to be sincere and true and original and all those things. So by giving the poems that I translated the context, it was easier for the readers to understand what I was pointing at and where I was, moving towards. But on the other hand, I have been told point blank in my face that, one, there is no such thing as language poetry in the world. You made it up. And I said, no, it's really there. And then one of the poets, very well-known poets, he lives in Mandalay, a northern city in middle Myanmar. And two poets from Hawaii visited Mandalay, and he was with them. And he asked those two poets from Hawaii if they had heard of John Ashbery, and they said no. So this guy came down to Yangon, and he said, Zeyar Lynn is lying. There is no John Ashbery in America. You know what saved me? During that year, this person who translated that first anthology, In the Shade of the Pine Tree, Mount Danu, he was the Burmese participant in Iowa writing program. When he came back, the first article he wrote in the magazine was how astonishing John Ashbery was, because Ashbery came that year to Iowa, and that saved me. If not, I would be a liar now, making up poets in America and movements in America.
Well, maybe John Ashbery really is a figment of our imagination. Can I get you to read one more poem before we close the radio show?
Yes, the last poem I have in this anthology is called Sling Bag. Almost all men in our country, carry that sling bags, and they put everything into their bag. And, when I get this, just let me say, inspiration, I just had to write it down without checking anything, without censoring myself, and only when that urge to write is gone, I finish it. Okay, so I don't have a premeditated form or premeditated idea of what I'm going to write about, but I feel that this poem is about something that is integral to our being, to our hearts in Burma, but which was not allowed to come out, which was swallowed inside. Sling bag. Wherever he goes, In his sling bag, he carries his severed leg. If he has to shake hands, he takes his severed leg out from the bag and touches it on the other person's hand as he says, "Nice to meet you." He must have gone through a lot of suffering with that severed leg in his bag, though he still has 2 legs intact. When he needs reassurance, he'll insert his right hand, like a dead hand, into the bag slung on his right shoulder to feel the sinews and the greasy slime of the severed leg. That's how he recharges himself. That's how his pride is uplifted, his self-confidence restored. The severed leg serves as his pillow when he sleeps. The severed leg is placed on the dining table when he eats. Is he married? Let's say he is. When he makes love to his wife, the severed leg welds their 2 bodies together. Only then does he feel the hit, he says. The severed leg is his life, his past, his present, and his future. He says, it's truth. He says, it's honesty. He says, it's just him, says someone else. Someone who claims to be a childhood friend. He, too, always carries a sling bag. Do you want me to read that in Burmese?
I do, indeed.
Okay, this is Burmese. Lue 8. Tu be toa toa, tu e te ma amye pa da, tu che te phet piat. Lu twe net, let swဲနှုတ်ဆက်စရာရှိရင်တစ်ဖက်လူရဲ့လက်ကိုသူ့အိတ်ထဲကခြေတစ်ဖက်ပြတ်ထုတ်ပြီးထိလိုက်တယ်ဟုတ်ကဲ့တွေ့ရတာဝန်တာပါတယ်သူအရန်ခံစားရမှာပဲနော်အိတ်ထဲမှာခြေပြတ်ကြီးနဲ့သူ့မှာလဲနှစ်ဖက်စလုံးကောင်းတဲ့ခြေနှချောင်းနဲ့သူစိတ်ရှုပ်လာရင်သူ့ညာလက်ကိုသူ့ညာဘက်ပခုံးမှာလွယ်ထားတဲ့လွယ်အိတ်ထဲလက်တွေတစ်ဖက်လိုထိုးထည့်ပြီးခြေတစ်ဖက်ပြတ်ရဲ့အမြင်တွေအကြည့်အချွဲတွေအရေးတွေဆန်းဆန်းပြီးသူ့မှာမိုးအားတွေပြည့်လာတယ်မာနတွေတက်လာတယ်ယုံကြည်မှုတွေမြင့်မားလာတယ်ညာအိတ်ရင်အဲ့ဒီခြေတစ်ဖက်ပြတ်ကိုခေါင်းအောင်တယ်ထမင်းစားရင်ထမင်းစပွဲပေါ်အဲ့ဒီခြေတစ်ဖက်ပြတ်တင်စားတယ်သူ့မှာမိန်းမရှိလားရှိတယ်ပဲထားပါတော့သူ့မိန်းမနဲ့ဆက်ဆံရင်သူတို့နှစ်ကိုကြားအဲ့ဒီခြေတစ်ဖက်ပြတ်ကိုထိထားတယ်အဲ့တော့မှထိတယ်ဆိုပဲအဲ့ဒီခြေတစ်ဖက်ပြတ်ဟာသူ့ဘဝသူ့အတိတ်သူ့ပြစ္ဆုတ်ပံသူ့အနာဂတ်တဲ့အဲ့ဒါသစ္စာတဲ့အဲ့ဒါယူသားမှုတဲ့အဲ့ဒါသူပဲတဲ့ဒါကဘေးလူတယောက်ကပြောတာသူနဲ့ငယ်ကလေးကရင်းနှီးခဲ့တယ်လို့ပြောတာပဲသူ့မှာလဲသွားလေရအမြဲပါတယ်လူအိတ်တစ်လုံးနဲ့ Thank you.
Zeyar Lynn reading Sling Bag from the new anthology Bones Will Crow. You have been listening to Zeyar Lynn on Penn Sound's Close Listening, produced with the Clock Tower Radio at artonair.org. For more information on Penn Sound, go to writing.upenn.edu/PennSound. The program was recorded on October 7th, 2013 at the Kelly Writers House at the University of Pennsylvania. This is Charles Bernstein, for whom close listening is socialism of the ear. Thanks so much. That's great.